We are Sex Bob-Ombs! 1, 2, 3, 4! The cult classic movie Scott Pilgrim vs. the World has been making its mark on pop culture for over 10 years now. With its Netflix anime series Scott Pilgrim Takes Off officially out, it's a great time to revisit this hilariously awkward rom-com that just oozes early 2010s. I'm Keefe Nosy with Wicked Binge, and this is Scott Pilgrim vs. the World characters, good to evil. As usual, we're going to start off with the most innocent characters, and we'll be working our way down. These are the good characters. Taking home the gold medal of good is Scott's good-natured gamer friend, young Neil, or just Neil, as he's rightfully upgraded to by the end of the movie.
I'm Neil.
While most of the characters from this movie are either defined by, or at the very least given, one major character flaw, Neil is an exception to the rule, hence his placement at the top of our list.
This guy's good.
He's a loyal friend to Scott, Kim, and Steven, always attending their performances and encouraging the band, despite technically not really being in it. If that's not enough to cement his loyalty, let's also mention his obvious crush on Knives, which he of course holds off on until after Scott breaks up with her and she approaches him to try and reclaim her lover. On top of being loyal, mild-mannered, and just an all-around nice person, there isn't anything bad to say about Neil, and for that, we present him with a shiny gold medal to go on his newly inherited bass guitar. The silver medal of good goes to Scott's little sister, Stacy Pilgrim. Despite being one of the youngest members of the ensemble cast at only 18 years old, Stacy's basically the closest thing in this entire cast to a responsible adult, which is ironic considering she barely even qualifies as one. Still, she's fully accepted the role despite its irony. She provides Scott with advice, and lectures when needed, about his absolute mess of a love life. She shows equal concern for both his emotional well-being and his overall morality, trying to push him to do the right thing by breaking up with Knives before dating Ramona. Like with Neil, there isn't really anything bad to say about Stacy, though she does catch a hold of Wallace's gossip pretty quickly, which might imply that it's a bad habit for her as well. Rounding out the top three is 17-year-old Knives Chow, aka the Catholic high school girl Scott dated to get over Envy Adams. He's still being a bit of a creep and a lot of a jerk by using her to get over a breakup.
You're too good for him. Run.
It's all the more heartbreaking given just how sweet and caring Knives is. She instantly becomes a fan of the Sex Bob-Ombs, cheering them on at their performances at the Rocket, and is always super affectionate towards Scott. But when she's ultimately dumped in favor of Ramona, she goes on a sort of mini-villain arc. Well, more of a trying to desperately get Scott jealous by dating Neil arc. That phase, while understandable, earns her the Envy Sinner medal for how mad she was at Ramona, even attacking her during Scott's fight with G-Man before she knew Scott had cheated. Ultimately, though, Knives does forgive Scott and gives him her blessing to pursue Ramona, showing that she's still an extremely compassionate and forgiving person at the end of the day. And also way too cool for Scott, frankly. Next up is the first legit member of the Sex Bob-Ombs, Steven. Steven is probably the most passionate about the band. He works the hardest to get them gigs to try and get their name out there, and he'll jump at any opportunity he can get.
That's right.
This does sometimes come at the cost of his integrity, though. He signs on with the sleazy Gideon Graves for a 3-album deal, which, to his credit, would be a hard deal to resist.
She knows we suck.
Though it is going to earn him the Greed Sinner medal. He also doesn't have an issue having the band open for Envy Adams, despite knowing how much she hurt Scott. All that aside, Steven isn't a bad guy. He's just really passionate about the band and wants them to succeed. He's also willing to accept Scott's apology for his messed up behavior and to help him defeat G-Man, showing where his loyalty really lies. Rounding out the good category is the band's lovely drummer/announcer, Kim Pine. Soft-spoken she is not. You'll best remember her as the red-haired drummer who introduces the band, whether in practice or at a recital. Kim isn't the most outwardly nice character by any means, but that's not to say that she's bad, nor even particularly flawed.
And I really don't care.
She makes fun of Scott a lot throughout the movie, but given the fact that Scott is an ex who hurt her way worse than he acknowledged for a long time, we can understand that even if it isn't totally justified. She can be a little aggressive though, like her instant rage at a revival band also having a girl drummer.
They have a girl drummer.
But like Steven, she accepts Scott's apology in the end and kicks off the band performance that would help Scott beat Gideon. That's just enough to let her avoid the more questionable categories. This is the gray area. Starting off this tier is Julie Powers. She's more ready and willing than anyone to call out Scott on his less than savory relationship history. He has a pattern of hurting his exes without much concern for their well-being, and she does try her best to keep him away from Ramona. Julie is one of those characters who just pops up everywhere, so her motives are never exactly crystal clear. For every moment she's looking out for people and calling out bad behavior, there's another where she's being unnecessarily rude and spending her time around unsavory folks like Envy and her new boyfriend Todd. Julie is really the closest thing to a totally neutral party in the movie. She's sarcastic at worst and just doing her own thing at best, so we won't place her any higher nor lower. Next up is Scott's affectionately dubbed gay roommate, Wallace, who's going to win the Lust Sinner medal right away. He stalks actor Lucas Lee, his words, not ours,
Stalking him later.
and when Stacy brings her boyfriend to Scott's band performance, he's making out with him within a few minutes. And given Stacy's response being, again? It's implied he has in fact done this before. The man simply has no chill when it comes to his romantic endeavors.
I want to have have as adopted babies.
He's also a gossip who spreads everyone's business around like it's a freaking virus. Wallace isn't a hero by any means, but he's also not particularly malicious at any point. At times, he can be a good friend who gives Scott solid advice and genuinely cares for him. He even encourages him to take down Gideon at the end of the movie, showing that he still has some principles that he won't compromise. Now it's time to finally mention the first of the two main characters of the movie, Ramona Flowers. If you've ever fallen hopelessly for a girl with colored hair, blame her. Okay, jokes aside, Ramona might initially appear to be the perfect girl since we see her from Scott's point of view, but the rose-colored glasses slip off after a while. There's a case to be made that the whole point of Scott Pilgrim's story is that you shouldn't idolize relationships, because at the end of the day, nobody's necessarily any less imperfect than you. Ramona as a character is a great illustration of this message. Initially, she's totally cool, open-minded, pretty hot, what's not to like, but she's also broken her fair share of hearts in the past, and tends to be a bit standoffish. She chose to move on from America to Canada to try and leave her past behind, which is admirable to an extent, but with Scott in tow, she was forced to finally confront all of the shady figures from her past. Like Scott, she's just a bad person who's learning to be a bit less of a bad person through the power of love. And as corny as that is, it's still pretty sweet. Now it's finally time to talk about the main character himself, Scott Pilgrim. He's a total slacker who's doing not so great after a tough breakup. Said breakup leads him to date a high schooler, and to his credit, this wasn't to try and make any sexual advances on her, but not making sexual advances on a high schooler isn't really a high bar to hit. He only dates Knives Chow to get over envy, since Knives is young and therefore too innocent to hurt him like she did. Scott ultimately shows his total lack of concern for her feelings by waiting to break up with her until he'd been dating Ramona for a while already, which we reward him with the Sloth Cinder Medal for. He's a double cheater with minimal concern for the feelings of others until the very end of the movie.
I feel like I learned something.
That said, he's shown to have overcome at least some of his selfishness by the end of the story. He ultimately saves Ramona from Gideon, apologizes to Knives and Kim for hurting them in the past, and even shows his appreciation for Neil by giving him his position as a bass guitarist in the band. While Scott's still not a model citizen, he's on the path to becoming a better person, so let's hope he stays on it. And while this may seem odd, we're ending the gray area with the first two of Ramona's 7 evil exes, the Kateyanagi twins. Here's the thing about these two. Unlike the other exes who assaulted Scott directly at various points in the movie, the Kateyanagi twins do not. They happen to also be musicians, and as such, their fight with Scott is a battle of the bands type of deal. They have to lose a lot of points for being aligned with Gideon, sure, but there's simply very little to go off with these two, which earns them a spot just outside of our final category. So now it's time for the real bad guys. This is the bad to evil. Kicking things off here is the first boss, so to speak, Matthew Patel. First sin, that absolute travesty of an outfit. If you're gonna be a pirate, at least fully commit to it.
Are you a pirate?
Pirates are in this year?
But I digress. Matthew, like most of Ramona's other exes, attempts to defeat Scott in combat, and he does so during one of the Sex Bob-omb's public performances, endangering others with his fireballs and demon hipster chicks. That said, while he's no less vengeful than the other exes, we're gonna give him some points for presentation. Like, the guy put on a whole musical number in a movie that isn't even adjacent to a musical. We really didn't even know what hit us in the slightest until after it was over. Plus, he was considerate enough to email Scott to let him know about the fight. That was nice of him, right? The next spot goes to Scott's own evil ex, Envy Adams. She was said to be a kind and caring person by Scott until her fame got to her head. Now, much like Ramona's League of Evil Exes, she's vengeful towards Scott and wants to crush any attempt at romantic happiness he makes.
I think we should get out of here.
She's difficult to rank given that she's rarely actually seen in the movie. That said, she doesn't really seem to have many good qualities at this point, but we also can't really put her any lower since she does seem to be genuinely reconsidering who she is as a person when Scott calls her by her real name, Natalie.
No one calls me that anymore.
Hopefully that reflection will ultimately make her into a better person. Up next, we have the reason the group is called Evil Exes rather than Evil Ex-Boyfriends, Roxy Richter. Ramona's sole ex-girlfriend tries to attack Scott when he's alone and unguarded, which makes her one of the most ruthless but intelligent of Ramona's exes. She's also willing to fight both Ramona and Scott, showing the extent of her bi-furiosity. The sheer level of rage she exhibits earns her the Wrath Sinner Medal. Thankfully, at the climax of the battle, her weak spot is found at the back of her knees, taking a dangerous threat down before she could do any more harm. Time to hit the in-universe big screen for our bronze medalist of evil, Lucas Lee, the most physically strong of Ramona's exes. Here, there was no warning email, nor even a sneak attack to give him an idea of what's to come. It was quite literally on site with Lucas, and he had no problem thrashing Scott on the set of his latest project.
He's famous and he talked to me.
Were it not for him being too stubborn and prideful to avoid doing an ollie on a mortally dangerous railing, Lucas might have spelled the end of Scott's quest. On that note, we will give him the Pride Sinner Medal since his own pride was quite literally his own downfall. There isn't particularly anything good to say about Lucas either, we just think that the last couple characters are a bit worse. The Silver Medal of Evil goes to resident super vegan Todd Ingram. His veganism gives him extremely strong superpowers, and believe us when we say that those powers are very much in the wrong hands. Todd is reckless, arrogant, and violent.
I'm a rock star.
Oh my God.
He has no problem hitting women, even Knives, who's still a young girl. His assault on Scott was among the most violent out of all Ramona's exes, but if nothing else, we can dispense some justice to him by giving him the Gluttony Sinner Medal for committing the unforgivable vegan sin of drinking half and half. But really, the fight for Gold Medal of Evil is no competition when Gideon Graves is in the running. Also known as G-Man, Gideon is the final boss of the movie. Out of all Ramona's exes, he's the one who affected her the most. He even attempts to buy off Scott and the sex bombs with a record deal so he could have Ramona to himself with no consequences. But wait, if Ramona's really that into him, what's the problem? Well, the problem is this.
That is evil.
The fact that this dude put a microchip in Ramona's neck to track her and do God knows what to her mind. When Ramona said he had a way of getting into her head,
It's his way of getting into my head.
who would have thought she meant it literally? There's no doubt about him being the gold medalist of evil. Oh, sorry. I mean, her being the gold medalist of evil, at least with a nut shot like that. I mean, you won't have to have your evil genes passed on to another generation, G-woman.